Radio TV Phono Nut here, and we have one of the old blue Califone 1410K classroom style phonographs. This was their entry-level model with no pause control and no little springy feet on the bottom for shock absorption. We simply have an off-on control, a volume knob, a tone control, and an external speaker jack, and of course a 4-speed motor. In this case, this happens to be an Alliance mechanism. We have the track light tone arm, which was their trade name for the tone arm with the little light on the end of the head shell for use in dark areas. Amplifier works good in this. The cartridge needle plug-in assembly works, but it could probably stand to be replaced. The pots were a bit scratchy. I went ahead and sprayed them. Mainly what this needs is some mechanical work. This lever, okay, is a little bit stiff, which seems to be common with older Alliance mechanisms. Based on date codes I'm finding, I think this is from 1977. Which was probably about the end of the line for the Alliance mechanisms. I think they got out of the phono drive business sometime around then, but General Industries stayed in the phono drive business for a good bit longer. I think they were probably around at least until the early 2000s, but Califone in the late 80s started using a cheaper plastic mechanism with a DC motor to cut cost, of course. Actually, Califone's downslide started in the early 80s when they started using plastic platters instead of the metal platters on their record players, but at least they still had the good AC motor until about 1989, and that's when they really went to heck in a handbasket. Alright, this one here is in relatively decent cosmetic shape. It's not all rusty and crusty and dirty. We got a little paint loss right here. If I could get some white touch-up paint, that could probably be fixed. On the side of the case we have some writing, magic marker writing, Ardmore United Methodist Church, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Fortunately that's kind of faded, so maybe I can clean that off. I understand why schools and churches and other institutions did that. It was a theft deterrent, but 40 or 50 years later it's aggravating when you find one that's in otherwise nice cosmetic condition, but it's all scribbled on. Now, as far as these classroom record players, you know, over the years I've done a lot of videos on these. I've picked up a lot of these over the years. A few of them I found locally. Most of them were bought online from places like eBay and the Goodwill auction site. eBay has about gotten to the point where I just can't buy anything off of there anymore because of the often ludicrous asking prices, and if I find something that's reasonably priced, they've got the shipping jacked way up. For example, you find a record player for 15 bucks and they want $77.39 for shipping. You know, no way is that economical for me. Now on Goodwill, the stuff on there seems to be cheaper, although in recent months and years it seems like its prices are going up there as more people have found out about that site. But the shipping is usually more reasonable. I don't know why that is. Maybe Goodwill has some kind of sweetheart deal with FedEx. I don't know, but what I'm saying is, as far as these classroom record players, I'm probably going to stop fooling with these unless it's something I find locally for a very cheap price or free, or unless it's something really rare, preferably something from the vacuum tube era that I don't have and would probably want to hang on to. You know, as far as buying every model that comes along, and then later when I decide I want to do some house cleaning and try to unload some of them and get stuck with them or end up losing my shirt, then that's not going to work. Now, back in the 1990s, I could pick up these kind of record players locally. I remember a fella I knew at the time went to one of the county school auctions and bought a couple of pallets of them for little or nothing. And the ones that worked, I think he was selling them in his resale shop for about 50 bucks a piece. And a few of the ones that didn't work, he just gave them to me. And I turned around and fixed them and sold them. I didn't get $50 a piece for them, but back then you could buy an 89T cartridge for about $5 and some change, and you could buy an idler wheel for $5 or $6 and some change if one was needed. And then I could turn around and sell the record players for about 20 to 25 bucks. Wasn't much room for profit there, but at least I was getting a little something out of them and having some fun in the process. At least I wasn't going in the hole on them. Nowadays, like I said, these rarely ever turn up locally, and when they do turn up locally, they're usually overpriced. If I buy one online, that involves shipping, and about 25 bucks is the cheapest, the absolute cheapest that I can get one here buying it online, and that's off of the Goodwill site, assuming the shipping is cheap and nobody else bids against me on it. And nowadays 89T cartridges are not $5 a piece anymore. They quit making them for years, and now Fan Steel has recently started making them again, and now I think they're about 35 bucks plus the sales tax, so you figure close to 40 bucks. And I've not purchased one yet, so I can't really speak for the quality, but I can tell you the last Fan Steel cartridges I had were not all that great. The red one, that's a single-sided LP only, sounded like crap, tracked like crap, gouged records, and only reproduced 1/2 of a stereo record, whereas these old cartridges combine the left and right for mono. Now the green 78 cartridge, I still use those, and you know, those work okay, but mono 78s and stereo micro groove records, that's a totally different ball game. I thought about ordering one of the new Fan Steel cartridges just to see, but I would be really pissed if I paid 35, close to 40 bucks for one and get it here and it doesn't perform like I think it should. So we just haven't done that. The other option would be to install a Fan Steel P226, which is a Varco TN4B knockoff, but there's a couple of problems there. The output voltage on those is not high enough, and I would have to build some kind of preamp circuit to boost it up a little bit. These really sound like crap if you use a cartridge with lesser than normal output voltage. The 89T is good for about 1.3 to 1.5. The Varco is good for about 1/2 volt, so it doesn't work too well. And another problem with these Caliphones, they have a light in the end of the tone arm. Now I could disable the light and the bracket would fit in there, but with the light still in place, there's no room to put a conventional mounting bracket in here, so you just about have to go with the 89T if you want to keep things original. So you know, in today's world, figure I give say 25 bucks for a record player, and then the cartridge is shot, have to pay another 35 bucks for one of those, and if the wheel's bad, that's another 35 bucks for a rebuild. So we're already into this close to 100 bucks. Well, any of these that I've sold locally on Facebook, about 60 is about all I can pull out of one, and even at that, that's not a quick sale. That's usually a sit on there for weeks and weeks and weeks and have 60 looky-loos, but nobody's sending me a message that's serious about buying. And then in the meantime, you get all the scammers that asking if the item is still available or trying to pull something else that's an obvious scam. and then eventually you might get somebody to contact you that actually realizes the value of something like this and is willing to pay the price. But it's 60 bucks. About the only way I can do it and not go in the hole is if I can get it cheap, and if I don't have to replace the wheel or the pickup cartridge, and that's not the case 98% of the time. So, and the harsh reality is most people are cheap. They want something for nothing. They expect it to be in perfect condition and come with a warranty for no more than 10 or 15 bucks. And all the griping in the world from me isn't going to change that. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it always will be. I know my dad used to do woodworking, and people would contact him about building something, and then he'd tell them the price, and then they would suddenly lose interest. And he used to say, I guess these people think that materials are free, and that all of my tools were free, and that my time isn't worth anything. So he just finally got to the point where when somebody inquired about building something, he'd just tell them, I don't have time to fool with that. Now the problem was, they thought his handmade stuff ought to be cheaper than what they could go to Ultimate Particle Board Furniture World and buy something for. But what they failed to realize was the stuff my dad was building, who was very meticulous, it had to be just perfect, or he wouldn't let it out of his shop. But the stuff my father was building was much better quality than the crap that they could buy at Ultimate Particle Board Furniture World, and I think that's part of the problem with these old record players. People see that they can buy a Crosley Cruiser at Walmart for what, $39.95 or $49.95, and they see me wanting 60 bucks for an old record player, and they think, oh, well, I'm not paying you that for that. I can go buy a brand new one for less money. Well, yeah, you can, but the one you can buy for 40 bucks at Walmart is going to be a inferior piece of crap in comparison to something like this. So yeah, I'm really having to reevaluate things over here and stop buying every little thing that I see. I'm going to have to be way more selective about what I drag home, and basically only drag it home if it's something that I want to hang on to. You know, if it's something that I feel like that I'm not going to want to hang on to, that sounds like a about as redneck, not going to want to hang on to, but if it's something that I'm sure I'm probably not going to keep, then I really don't need to bother with it, because like I've said before, you know, this is a hobby. I don't try to make mega bucks off of this stuff, but I would at least like to get my investment back out of the stuff. And nothing's more disheartening when you put your time and money into something, getting it perfect, and you list all of that in the ad, and then some jackass messages you and expects to get it for a little or nothing. Had a woman pull that with me with a Califone record player, and I just finally got so pissed that I pulled the ad down and gave the record player to a disabled friend who needed something to play his 45s on, and he was most appreciative of it. And I'd much rather give something to somebody who really needs it and doesn't have an entitlement attitude over dealing with these people who could afford to buy it but just expect something for nothing and think it's owed to them. Alright, so enough babbling on about that. Let's open it up and see what we have here. And here's the amplifier board, and that's basically the same amp that they used from the late 1960s until around 1990 or 91, somewhere around in there, at which time they switched to using a different amplifier that was IC based. Here's the motor, typical AC phono drive motor with a secondary winding on it to provide a low voltage to the amplifier, which is rectified and filtered. And here's our rear firing 4x10 inch speaker. I've already looked at the EIA code on here. It looks like the speaker was made by McGregor. I really can't say that I've heard of that company. Maybe you have. And the date code looks like first week of 77. And they were nice enough to give us a schematic diagram in the bottom of the cabinet. Now, you may be wondering why a rear firing speaker, which is the way the 1410K and the 1420K was. Well, the reason I think for the rear firing speaker, I know it seems a bit odd, but they probably did it that way so the record player's controls could face the operator and then the speaker could be pointed towards the audience, which is really a clever thing, really. Now the 1420K, the only difference between it and the 1410K is it has a pause control and the little shock mounted springy feet on the bottom. The 1430K is the one with the 10 watt amplifier and front firing 6x9 inch speaker. The 1435K has variable pitch. The 1450K has separate bass and treble controls and a microphone input, and the 55K has variable pitch added. And the 1410 was a carryover model number from the vacuum tube era. The 1410, first started out around 69 or 70, somewhere around in there, and was their last vacuum tube model. And then in about 72, that was replaced with the 1410 SS, which stood for 1410 solid state. And then that model was made until about 74 when they introduced the models with the track light tone on them. And then the 1410 became the 1410K model. And then I believe in the early 80s the 1410 was discontinued as the entry-level model, and the 1420 became the entry-level model. And here we are with the platter removed. Idler wheel turns freely, that's nice. I can see some oil on the spindle here, and a fair amount of crud. I've seen a lot worse. I'm not going to go over this step by step, but we'll clean the inner rim of the platter with a paper towel dampened in 90% isopropyl alcohol. Don't need any oil or grime there. And then we will remove the idler wheel, which is held on by this small E-clip here. And then we'll clean every bit of this as best we can to get all the dirt and crud out of it. Take all this apart, clean it up really good, put a couple of drops of oil on the shaft here where everything slides. Clean this slider up and put some super lube on that where it will slide more smoothly. We'll pull this spindle out, which is held in place by an E-clip from the underside, and there will be a washer on the top side of the spindle and possibly one under the clip too. Don't lose those washers. And then we'll clean out the center of this with a Q-tip and alcohol, and clean up the spindle with a paper towel and alcohol, and then put some super lube on that, followed by a couple of drops of zoom spout. Put the spindle back in, clip it in place, wipe up any excess grease and oil that slips out, and then we'll pull the motor out, take it apart, clean it really well, and re-oil it with zoom spout. The motor mounting grommets look to be in pretty good shape, so they can probably remain. And then we'll clean the idler wheel with a paper towel and alcohol, and put a drop of oil on that shaft where it'll turn noise free. And then while the motor is running, we will clean the capstan of the motor. We don't want any amount of lubricant or oil or anything like that on the motor capstan, on the rubber surface of the wheel, or on the inner rim of the turntable platter. Even the slightest amount of oil or grease on those areas will cause problems. As far as solid state era Califone record players, this era here was probably the best. I'd say from roughly about 1974 until about 1982 or so, that was probably their best era because of this track-like tone arm. It seems to be pretty sturdy and actually bolted to the metal motor board here, and because they actually use a metal turntable platter. The older ream Califone units used a standard astatic curved tone arm, and the problems those sometimes had was there was a rubber gasket thing here where it bolted onto the motor board, and that gasket would sometimes deteriorate and the nut would come loose and the arm would start flopping around. That can be fixed, but what was really problematic was on some of the astatic arms that Califone used. You had this rubber bushing in here that's part of the tone arm assembly. I've seen that rubber bushing turn to powder, and I've also seen it melt, and there's really no way you can replace that. You have to change the whole tone arm out, and that can be a problem all these 50 years later. And back then it wasn't a big deal. You just order a new tone arm and that's it. But I don't think I've ever seen one of these newer tone arms with a melted or crumbly rubber bushing here. Now, starting in about 82 or 3, somewhere around in there, they started using plastic turntable platters, and like I said, that was their downfall. You can replace those platters with a metal General Industries platter if you can get your hands on one. So like I said, I think these here with the track-like tone arm, the metal platter, and the AC motor are probably the best ones, and those cover the models in the blue case and the earlier models in the brown case. The later brown cased ones and the gray cased ones pretty much all had plastic platters on them. And here's an example of a 1430K from 1987. Still has the good AC motor in it, but uses a plastic platter. It might not be quite so bad if these plastic platters actually had a metal bushing in the center here, but it doesn't. It's all plastic. Even those cheapy platters on a 1960s kiddie phonograph that had the little rubber dots around on the platter had a metal bushing in the platter center there. And here's a 1420K from 86, I believe. Very similar looking to the 1430K, except this has a 5-watt amp. This one has a 10-watt amp. The 1420K has the rear firing speaker, and also still has the plastic turntable, but has the good AC motor, so that's a plus. Now this is when they started getting crappy. This is a 1450C and a 1430C. As you can tell, they look very similar to the two older ones, but these two have DC motors. How can you tell if your model has a DC motor? Look at the model number suffix. On the old ones, K meant track light tone arm. On the newer ones like this, the C suffix means DC drive motor. Another way you can tell is look at the speed control lever. See how it's shaped, and it's made out of, it's all plastic, and it has a very cheap feel to it. That's because the whole mechanism is made out of plastic. If your speed control lever looks like that, then you've got a DC motor. Because as I understand it, there was a conversion kit offered to convert some of the older Caliphones that had AC motors over to DC drive motors, so it's not likely that very many are out there with the updated motor, but there may be some out there. So if your speed control lever looks like that, you have a DC motor. And that's what the old speed control lever looks like with the AC motor. It's a metal lever with a plastic knob on it. Now this 1450C, it's from 1989. It has the separate volume and bass and a microphone input. But these first generation DC motor models were crap. really they were crap. First off, they did away with the pause brake feature. On the old ones, when you flipped it to pause, it would retract the idler wheel and apply a brake to instantly stop the turntable while the motor kept running. On these first generation DC motor driven models, all they simply do is remove the voltage from the motor, and that's it. Another problem these had, I'll get a screwdriver and show you, is originally these used an all plastic idler wheel with a rubber tire on them, and this idler wheel mounting arm was also made out of plastic. Those idler wheels were horrible. They would get hard, they would crack. This plastic idler wheel arm was very flimsy, and it just caused all kind of problems. And that's what this one had when I got it. Well, Califone quickly realized their mistake, and they offered an upgrade to a metal idler arm and a metal hubbed wheel. Now, the metal hubbed wheel will not directly interchange with the plastic wheel, so they had to come out with a whole new metal idler wheel arm to accommodate the metal wheel. I took this wheel and this arm off of a junker Califone that was too badly cosmetically challenged to worry with, and now it works a lot better. But these little puny DC motors don't seem to hold up as long as the AC motors. Usually the AC motors, all they need is a good cleaning and lubrication, and they're good to go. These DC motors, they tend to get noisy. You can put a couple of drops of oil on the top bushing and it'll usually quieten them down for a while, but they'll eventually get noisy again, and then they'll eventually just wear out and not work at all. And you can see what I'm talking about with these plastic platters. Not even a metal bushing in the center, it's just all plastic, and sometimes that'll just wear out and the platter will just wobble and drag on the speed control lever. So here's the last of the 1400 series. This is a 1430C from 1992. They had already introduced the 1000 AV line by 92. So this one here was probably just using up old parts and just finishing off these models to get ready to go full blown with these models. Now, this particular 1430C, it uses the same IC based amplifier as this 1010 AV uses. However, on this 1430C, it still has the DC motor, but they went back to using a metal platter, and they went back to using the old style pause brake and idler wheel retract method of pausing the turntable. And they had the standard metal idler wheel and metal idler wheel mounting arm. So at least that's a good thing. Now, if this DC motor were to crap out in this, I could install a General Industries mechanism in here that uses an AC motor and still keep my pause feature, and I could still use this metal platter on the General Industries mechanism. Now here's the 1010 AV from 1992 or 3, somewhere around in there, and this one uses a 4x10 inch speaker, whereas this one uses a 6x9 inch speaker. But like I said, both use the same amplifier. We no longer have the pause brake type pause control. We just simply have a switch that disconnects the motor from the DC power source, and the motor stops pretty quickly. Also, we have a metal platter, but those metal platters didn't last too long. I think by about 94 or so they had gone back to using the plastic platters. This one here is still made in USA, but I think by about 97 they had shifted production to China, and there were several different model versions of the 1010 AV. The last one used a plastic platter and a 3-position slide switch for 33, 45, and 78. There was also the 1030 AV that was the the higher end model that had a microphone input and I believe an auxiliary input, and then there was the 1035 AV that had a variable pitch control. Now I've got one of the 1035 AVs from '94 that had the metal platter, but the motor in it was shot, and I replaced it with a General Industries, older General Industries type motor. Now on that one I lost my variable pitch control, but I think I have a way to add it back. We may do a video on that one day. So yeah, if you're going to get an older Califone, and if you want a solid state model, you know, try to stick with one from the mid 70s through about the early 80s, especially if it's one that any decent amount of money is gonna have to be forked over for. And as far as tube era Caliphones, my favorite ones are the large ones with the big 12-inch speaker in the lid. And as far as tabletop self-contained models, the stuff from the 50s, like the Califone, I don't remember the numbers. There was one in the mid 50s that had a round red metal grill on it with Califone written in script along the bottom of the grill. And then the Califone New Yorker models, I like those. So yeah, the tube stuff is okay for the most part, and the early solid state models are okay, but they have that problem with the tone arm that I mentioned earlier. Alright, so enough babbling. Let me get some stuff together and overhaul this mechanism in our blue 1410 and get it going again. Actually, the last idler wheel driven Califone, the one with the 3-position slide switch, even though those were made in China from about 98 until 2004 or so, those were actually an improvement over the older DC motor driven models with the plastic speed shifter lever. With them eliminating that and going with an electronic speed control, that eliminated the problems that the plastic mechanism gave. Now the one you don't want is the Califone 1005 AV. You don't even want to waste your time with that one. That one was introduced in around 2004 after they discontinued the idler wheel driven models. That one is basically just a Crosley with the Califone name on it. It uses the same Crosley belt driven cheapy plastic turntable mechanism. It does have 3 speeds, but it does not have a flip over stylus. Some of them had an AUE cartridge, and the later ones had the Chuo Denshi CZ800 style cartridge in them. There's no headphone jack, there's no metal corner protectors, they run off of a 12-volt wall wart. They're just a piece of crap. I have one only because that was the very last that I know of institutional record player made by anybody, and I think those were discontinued about 2017 or so. I'm really surprised they made these institutional record players as long as they did, because by the early 2000s I think most schools had stopped using records anyway. I know our school district dumped all of their record players and records in the early 2000s, except for some that may be stashed in some nook or cranny somewhere, but you know, good luck on getting them to let you have any of them. They'd rather send them to a recycling center and have them destroyed rather than sell them or give them away to somebody who could use them. Alright, we got all this cleaned up pretty good, but we're going to have to remove this clip that holds this idler wheel arm assembly thingy-madoodle bob to this shaft here, because it's very gunked up. Because normally when I'm in the neutral position, this arm should fall all the way back down here, but it's not doing so because it's all gunked up. See, that's what it's supposed to do, but this shaft is all gunked up and won't let the arm slide as freely as it should. So we're going to remove this clip, being careful not to let the clip or the spring fly off in the process. Alright, we have this off, and we're also going to have to remove this clip and separate these two pieces and clean everything. and put a drop of oil on it, because this is very gummy too. Yeah, we don't need gumminess, we need things to move freely. And to clean it, that'll involve some Q-tips, some rubbing alcohol, and some paper towels. And while we have that off, we'll clean all this a little more thoroughly. Now would be a good a time as any to lubricate this. I'll put a light layer of super lube on this sliding thing here, and then we'll put another little bit of super lube in these little sprocket things here, these notches here. And here's the super lube. Formerly we used a product called Phono Lube, but they don't make that anymore. They discontinued that, and this stuff here seems to work just as well, maybe even better. So the way I like to do this, I just cut off the end of a Q-tip, leaving it like that, and then we'll just dip this in our tube, get a little lubricant on there, and just spread it around here where we need to. Alright, see the gunk we're getting out of this idler wheel arm by sticking the Q-tip dipped in alcohol down in the hole there? No wonder it was sticking on the shaft and not sliding. Alright, we have everything cleaned, and we're ready to re-lubricate. And the way I like to re-lubricate these shafts is to take a clean Q-tip, put a couple of drops of zoom spout oil on it, and just coat this shaft with it. That's all you need. You don't need to get carried away there, because we don't want oil seeping out and getting into places where it doesn't need to get into. And that's moving nice and freely now. Now we'll oil the shaft that's on the mechanism the same way, Q-tip with a couple of drops of oil on it, and just coat the shaft, put this back on there. Well, I'll put a little bit of super lube on this bottom thing here where it slides, but I'll put oil on the shaft. This spring here, when you get ready to put that back, it's tapered. The bottom end is larger than the top end. The bottom end goes down, and then the up here at the top, of course, is where you'll put your clip. And of course you'll want to hold this spring down with one hand while you position the clip back in place with the other hand. Do not let this spring fly off, because you'll probably never find it again. Alright, that works a lot better. Now it's time to flip it upside down and remove the clip that holds this spindle in place and clean that out. And there's the clip that holds the spindle in place. There does not appear to be a washer under this clip, but there's definitely a washer up here unless somebody's removed it. Here's the spindle, and there's the washer I was talking about. Now we'll use a Q-tip and alcohol to clean down in this bushing here, and then we'll clean this spindle up itself. Put a little bit of or super lube, and then we'll put a couple of drops of zoom spout oil on top of that. Put it back in, clip it back into place, wipe up any excess, and it ought to be good to go. Alright, spindle's clean and lubricated and back in place. Yeah, I know I said I wasn't going to do a step-by-step, but I kind of did, didn't I? Alright, next we need to take the motor apart, and in order to do that we need a 1/4-inch nut driver and a flathead screwdriver, and we need to remove these 3 bolts that hold everything together. And keep in mind there's going to be some spacers and washers involved. Do not lose anything. And I believe the bolt that's off to the side here, where is it? This one here I think may be a bit shorter than the other 2 bolts, so keep that in mind too. Don't get your bolts mixed up when reassembling this thing. And this is a good time to mention, when you got one this old and it's cruddy, you can't just put a couple of drops of oil here, there, and yonder to get it going again, and you can't hose it down with WD-40. That's a misconception that a lot of people that don't know any better seem to have, that you can just open these things up, hose them down with WD-40, and slap a new needle on it and it's good to go. Well, you can't do that. When they get all gunky and dirty, you have to take them apart and clean them, and then re-lubricate them. And you shouldn't be hosing it down with WD-40 anyway. And here's the motor out. I'm holding the bolt heads to keep them from falling out. I don't want to lose my spacers and my washers. And I think somebody may have already been into this, because you see 2 bolts are silver colored. The one over here is black. I think the two silver bolts should be the ones that hold the actual motor together, and then the black one should be this bolt over here to the side. It's just a support thing to hold the motor level. Oh, and one other thing, take notice of the position that your motor stator is in. If when you put it back together, if you flip the motor stator upside down, it'll run backwards. Now that might be okay if you want to listen to hidden messages on certain rock albums, but if you want to play records in a normal fashion, you don't want your turntable running backwards. Alright, we have it apart, and one other hint, if you run up on one of these Alliance motors that's totally seized, do not try to force this bottom bushing assembly off, because if you do, you're probably going to pull the bushing straight out that's held in place by these little brass fingers here, copper colored fingers. And if you get it out, if you pull that bushing out of there, you're probably not going to get it back in there. I found that heat from a soldering iron will get this loose. It'll melt the old solid gummy oil to a point where you can easily pull this off. But do not, under any circumstances, try to force this off, or you're probably going to have trouble. Now we're going to clean this out with a Q-tip and some alcohol, and then we're going to clean up this shaft as best we can with a Q-tip and alcohol. We really can't separate everything because of this spring that's on here that increases the diameter of the shaft for 78 RPM. But it's usually not necessary to do that anyway. Just clean the shaft up and re-oil, and you're good to go. I soaked the felt wicking here in oil and put a few drops down in the center, and then do the same thing up here. Put it all back together, and as you're tightening the motor down, wrap on the stator with the butt end of a screwdriver to align the bushings, and make sure your rotor turns freely whenever you're done. If it doesn't, your rotor is binding and you need to align the bearings. Just tap on the motor hard a few times and that should do it. Alright, I've cleaned both the bottom end of the shaft and the top end of the shaft, and I've applied some zoom spout oil here to that wick. We'll just let it soak down in there and then spin it by hand and maybe put a couple more drops in there. Okay, we're back together and spinning freely. Now, assuming there's nothing else wrong with your phonograph, which I don't think this one is, I don't think this one has anything else wrong with it, we can put it all back in the cabinet now and screw the motor board back to the case, because what else we need to do can be done topside. And once you screw everything back together, this would probably be a good time to go wash your hands, because after working on this sort of thing, surely there's going to be some grease and oil on your hands, and we don't need to get any of that on the idler wheel, and that's going to be one of our remaining final steps. Oh, and one other thing, as far as these cone-shaped mounting grommets, these appear to still be okay, but if you run into those that have cracked or hardened or crumbling apart or whatever, you can still get those from the voiceofmusic.com, or you can get them from Antique Electronics Supply. A lot of times I just go ahead and replace them, but I'm kind of running low on them right now, and since these are still good, I'm just going to leave them be. Now with the motor running, we just dampen a paper towel with alcohol and just hold it up against the shaft like that, and then that will remove any gunk and oil and grease and crap that happens to be on there. Alright, everything's back in place. Let's put the platter back on and see what happens. Once you get it back together, while it's running, gently moderately press your finger up against the platter. And if you've got good torque, it should take a little effort to stop the platter. If your torque is lacking, the slightest touch will stop the platter, and then you need to go back and possibly clean up everything some more. The surface of the platter, the idler wheel, and the motor shaft. If that doesn't do it, you probably have a worn out idler wheel that needs to be replaced. And here we go. Long distance shouldn't give me Memphis, Tennessee. Help party, try to get in. Alright, 45. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Oddly enough, I have a 1420K from '74 that actually came from my elementary school at one time. I found it at the flea market. It's got the same amplifier as this one, but it does not sound as good, so I'm wondering if maybe they used a different speaker. I'm going to have to look into that. Yeah, that one's pretty beat up. The only reason I even keep it is because of where it came from and because it has the name of my first grade teacher written inside the lid. Here's a 78. And it appears that this cartridge does have the correct tip on the 78 side. A lot of these had dual LP tips. Sometimes we walk hand in hand by the sea, and we breathe in the cool, salty air. And of course, when not in use, always put it in the neutral position to preserve the automobile. As far as the cosmetics, we need to glue this covering back down inside the lid. And we need to clean it up a little bit, but on this metal motor board you want to be careful, because I found that this paint sometimes comes off very easily, as in this right here. So on that, you probably just want to give it a good dry wipe down and just get the dust off and be done with it. I'll try to get this writing off of here. I don't know if I can or not. Only time will tell, I guess. Well, with much elbow grease, I was able to get most of the writing off. You can still see a faint outline of it, but with the Windex and the rubbing alcohol and the contact cleaner and all that stuff combined, we got most of it off, as well as some of the dye in the case covering. So now this thing looks somewhat presentable. Or actually, it looks very presentable. Got a dog in the background that won't shut up, so he's fixing to go inside. Well, if the light hits this just right, you can tell some white streaking in here, but still, it looks better than it did with magic marker writing scribbled all over it. As far as cosmetics go, I have a few of these blue cased 70s Caliphones. This one's in better shape than any of the rest of them. And as far as a cartridge, one type of cartridge I might could use without having to compromise the light would be a tetrad stereo cartridge wired for mono. And the reason I say that is because some of the Califone stereo players that use this type of tone arm used a tetrad cartridge, but I would still have to build some kind of preamp circuit to bump up the output of the cartridge to make the amplifier in this thing happy. As far as sound quality, I've heard a lot of eras of 1410K and 1420Ks that both use the same amplifier, and the sound quality seems to be all over the place, depending on what era the record player is from. This one here seems to get louder and sound better than any of the rest of them I've heard, which is a bit unusual considering that all of them are supposed to use the same amplifier circuitry. The only thing I can come up with is possibly different vendors for speakers. Maybe one speaker is better than another, so that may be something we have to experiment with down the road, but it's not going to be today. I mean, I'm sure there was a multitude of suppliers that Califone got their speakers from. Like I said, this one, according to the EIA code, is McGregor. It just depends on the time the record player was made and what they could get for the least amount of money during any given time. Alright, I'm about done with this, but we probably will be down the road experimenting with a ceramic cartridge option for this, because 89Ts are starting to get too pricey. The Aesthetic originals don't show up that often anymore, and when they do show up, they're just expensive, and I'm just not going to go there. seeing as how this is something I'm going to keep when the time comes to replace this cartridge, which might already be here. Because just because a record player sounds good, that doesn't mean the needle isn't worn down. In fact, what I've always been told is by the time the needle is in bad enough condition that it's affecting the sound quality, it has already caused damage to your records. And what I used to do back in the day, whenever I would get a record player when the needle was in unknown condition, I'd just go ahead and replace it, because needles were cheap enough and no sense in taking the risk. But now that these cartridges are $35+, it's not so easy for me just to buy another one, especially when I don't know the quality of these newer fan steel cartridges. I know the Static and the older Electro Voice cartridges are good, but like I said, can't find them much anymore. Alright, that's about all I've got for this. Maybe one day we'll revisit this when we come up with some cartridge options, but for right now, that's all I've got. Might try to clean this up a little more. I don't know if those white streaks are the dye that's rubbed off or what, but you know, suffice it to say, I really wish they wouldn't scribble all over these things. It just takes away from the value of them in today's world.